let me take a moment to introduce a fun game that I'm playing with all my friends and my daughters. It's the Fearsome 5 game, okay? And I'd like you to actually play this game with me for a moment in your minds. In the Fearsome 5 game, you assemble in front of you the logos of Apple and Amazon, Microsoft, Facebook, and Google. Okay, you got it? Apple, Amazon, Microsoft, Facebook, and Google, any order you want. And then the fun game is you rip them out of your life. Okay? So which one do you want to rip out first? Shout one out. Facebook, I heard. Okay, Facebook. Gone. By the way, that was my first choice, too, because I think when we really do a deep analysis from a vantage point 15 to 20 years from now, we're going to discover that social media is pretty much a net negative for progress for human beings. I think it really is catastrophically dangerous. Anticipated, of course, brilliantly by Neil Postman long before the internet existed when he wrote his great book, Amusing Ourselves to Death. Okay? So, as a friend of mine liked to say 10 years ago, we spent in this country alone $2 trillion improving our telecommunication system, and another $2 trillion improving our computing infrastructure. Also, we could send videos of cats to one another. And so there's that. All right, so what are we ripping out next? Oh, by the way, I should mention that when you ripped out Facebook, you also killed a whole bunch of other functionality you might actually care about, like WhatsApp and Instagram and all kinds of things that people, in fact, do use. And indeed, people even do use Facebook in constructive, socially responsible ways in small percentages. Okay, what are we ripping out next? Somebody shout one out. Microsoft. Okay, let's take that one. Yeah, nobody's really fond of PowerPoint, really. So I get it, but in ripping out Microsoft, you've just ripped out most of the middleware and the plumbing that allows e-commerce to function. You've completely destroyed the ability for clouds to be secure with sort of second factor, two-factor identification capabilities and stuff like that. But I'm with you. I say we kill them. Okay, no problem there. What's next? What are we ripping out next? I heard Apple over here. Apple. All right, gone. And with that, the only company that has declared even a passing interest in making sure your cell phones are somewhat secure and able to manage your data, but that's okay. You know, let's just give ourselves over to the Android platform completely, because what could possibly go wrong there? All right, so Apple's dead. What are we ripping out next? Amazon. Okay, Amazon. You know, that's the one in this country when you play the Fearsome 5 game at scale that people rip out last. Because, you know, spoiled millennials keep saying, I'm going to have to go back to stores. I mean, that's going to be so inconvenient. So, but you've also just killed the only reasonable competitor to Netflix with Amazon Prime streaming videos. You've also killed Amazon Web Services, which is the infrastructure that powers literally 78% of all startups in North America. So there's that, okay? So what's left for us is just Google. So apparently we can look up stuff easily, as long as you don't mind the fact that every time you turn on your cell phone, within 5 minutes, at least 70 other companies have been alerted by all kinds of private information about you. So I guess what we're discovering, more or less the hard way, and sooner in other countries than in the States, is that there are dark sides to these extraordinarily successful organizations. If you haven't heard it yet, the biggest growth industry in Silicon Valley is, anybody know? Shrinks, providing counseling services to software folks who have discovered that when they thought they were saving the world, they were actually not. And it's a hard thing to come to. It's a very hard thing to stare in the mirror and say, I thought I was noble. I thought I was making the future show up somewhat ahead of its regularly scheduled arrival. And only belatedly did I discover that my company stopped using the phrase, don't be evil, 15 years ago. Okay? So this is the dark side of complicated systems. We are utterly dependent on them, and we are very, very poor at understanding the unintended consequences of systems as they succeed, as they get to scale, and as they get to transformational impact and become ecosystems of their own. There is no country on planet Earth that has anywhere close to the number of citizens that Facebook has. From time to time, they send senior executives, including Mark Zuckerberg, who still owns more than 50% of the enterprise, to go visit Congress for a while and play rope-a-dope with not very bright congresspersons who don't know what questions to ask about his system and how it functions and what it could be doing and what it should be doing and how to have it not just sort of casually destroy participative democracy as we know it. One of the gnarliest problems we face, ladies and gentlemen, as we try to figure out how to humanize and systematize systems, is to begin to see them in all of their nuance, all of their richness, all of their complexity, and to begin to understand what kinds of modern challenges we face in trying to get ecosystems to be digital, to move at extraordinary clock speeds, to have unbelievable fast rates of learning and improvement, as good digital systems tend to have, without having the kind of unintended consequences where they move much faster than governments, much faster than regulations, much faster than even people's ability to see what they're likely to have as unintended consequences. Now, we are extraordinarily lucky to have our next speaker, Saskia, with us today. She is a very gifted professor, beloved at Columbia, but I learned recently, thanks to her, that she spent the first portion of her career, almost 10 years, not far from here at the University of Chicago, a place that she learned to love, in part because it is a place where some of the smartest people on planet Earth get to spend time and be given enough resources so that they can take the time that it actually requires to think through something with all of its hard parts intact. So Saskia mentioned that she wrote her first and favorite book at the University of Chicago, one of 8 books that she's blessed us all with, and today she's gracing us with her presence to talk about how we might think about systems in a complicated way. Saskia, could we welcome you, please?
Well, it's a great pleasure to be here. I really enjoyed the prior talk. I wish he would be standing here and develop the second half of his very good analysis. And this is a great place you have here. He's not paying attention. It's okay. So it happens all the time. You already looked at all of this terribly interesting stuff, yes? So one of the ways in which I think we can cut across the sort of knowledge silos that the established universities force us into, and so we are now in a situation, footnote, where you have, it starts strong, and then as the decades go back, etc., we have very smart students working on little things, little wrinkles of the this and the that. I am really contesting that. I'm very interested in cutting across those silos. Let me clarify that 20 years ago, that was still a very good format, but then they ran out of stuff, so to say. And so you have very specialized this and very specialized that. It seems to me that right now, and for me it actually starts, so right now is a bit exaggerated, it starts in the 1980s. In the 1980s, we really do enter a new epoch. We keep referring to that epoch in the same terms as that epoch that started after World War II, I think the difference between World War II, like what happens in a country like this, and the 1980s, in the 1980s we have a new type of economy that develops. And one way of thinking about it is that it represents the rise of extractive logics. So let me clarify. Commerce is fine. The traditional bank did commerce. It sold money for a price. What we have today, and I'm going to talk especially about high finance, is an extractive mode. High finance is not benign. Traditional banking, you know, we all need a loan every now and then. You can say, okay, fine. And so, but there is a complexity that attaches to high finance, because on the one hand, it's an admirable form of knowledge. And so when you walk into Goldman Sachs, where before you had 100 secretaries, now you have 100, how do we call them? People who do very good. And physicists is one way of putting it, right? It's a mix of knowledges, but basically physicists. I'm not holding the physicists accountable for what has happened. They just practice their stuff. I use the case of the big financial firms today to illustrate one of the sharpest and most dramatic formulations of what is fairly widespread in our current economies of the West, but where it's a bit more diffuse. So again, focusing on high finance is a way of capturing the most extreme form. To do what I do, the kind of is slightly disruptive. It's an unsettlement of established categories for analyses, established modes of thinking, etc. I sort of like to mention that my zone is the zone before method, because method is still a very disciplining element. And we need method. I depend on method. But to do a certain type of work which involves discovering, understanding, detecting, it's not discovery as in discovery, but more detecting what the hell is actually happening, rather than the descriptions that we get. And there, for instance, something like microeconomics is still stuck in a reality that has changed very dramatically. It's an admirable form of knowledge, it's very complex, but it fails to capture some of the critical dynamics that we're dealing with today. And I am one of those who believes that, complex as the systems themselves are, we can understand the logics of it. I believe the simplest person, somebody who doesn't know how to read or write, they will understand a logic, which is different from the complexity of the actual apparatus, etc., etc. So one way of putting it again is situating vis-à-vis the paradigmatic, situating oneself at the edges of the paradigm. You don't throw the paradigm out of the window, because there's a lot of stuff there, a lot of information. But you don't need to become sort of, you know, a dedicated monk of that particular mode of analysis. So in that sense, sort of putting yourself at the edges of the paradigm, where the paradigm is weak, it begins to get mixed up with other paradigmatic edges. You know, that's an interesting place to be in when you want to go a bit lateral rather than, you know, higher and higher up. And so one language that I like to use is this notion of analytic tactics, or a tactical analytics. I never know. You can tell that I'm not an English-speaking person, and so I'm always debating what looks better. But right now I have analytic tactics, but I actually prefer a tactical analytics. You know, one goes through these things. We profs have time to do that kind of stuff. So here are just some examples. So one is this notion of destabilizing stable meanings. The economy, very stable meaning. The economy, right now there are two economies. One is the economy that we all know. The other economy is the economy that high finance is producing, which is radically different. As I said, nothing to do with our traditional economy. So what are the languages that we need? What are the categories that we need to begin to deal with that kind of stuff? I really can't. Can I move this a bit? No, I can't. Okay. I can't just see what I have there. So the second, no, it's okay, don't worry, because I have it here. So secondly, what happens when we position ourselves in the shadows rather than in the bright center of very powerful explanations and categories? What is it that we see and that we don't see? And that sort of is, again, an invitation. Are you going to? Oh, yeah, well, I don't know. Does it help? The question of the territorial, it has long fascinated me. And when I was at the University of Chicago, where I really became a monk, I wrote my best book there, 8 years, you know, it was amazing. But the question of the territorial, not territory as in sovereign national territory, but the multiplicity of territorialities that we actually produce. Whether we're poor or rich, we make the territorial. So it's not just the big master mother category of a national territory, but the territorialities that we produce. So if a poor neighborhood has a bit of autonomy, has a bit of options to make some of what they need themselves, rather than going to the multinational corporation that has set up a little shop, etc., right? These are all modes of constituting a kind of territory. Expulsions. Expulsions, I wrote this book on expulsions, and what I want to emphasize is that I was looking not at the expelling of people from a country. I was looking at how a country's system produces expulsions, renders invisible to a whole variety of actors who have a full materiality. They have a body, they are visible, but they actually become invisible. They might be sitting there, etc., but they don't matter. And so that for me is a really big deal that is happening today, and I see it, not just in the United States, in many other countries. Theory matters, but I also think that we need to de-theorize some of the stuff we have theorized in order to not throw it out of the window, but to re-theorize, to find new modes of. And I consider theory, it's a variable. At this end, it's a practice of thinking and figuring out, you don't have to be highly educated. You can still deal with it, because theory is a way of representing something. The X is not the same as the description in a way, right? So to me, this is a big deal, and this notion of re-theorizing, which again, young kids can do that. They may not call it theory, but they're doing it. And then finally, to shrink it a bit, to make it more manageable, my presentation, I'm just going to focus on the making aspect, how we are making certain conditions, making certain instruments that have certain types of consequences. One way of framing, just one of many ways, is to zero in on some element. And if I think of the old steam engine, when the steam engine appears, a long time ago, it doesn't change everything, but it changes enough to make a difference. And it's that changing enough that I'm after. In other words, we can have change without having to change everything. But we need certain vectors that are powerful vectors. And so, in this sense, the steam engine at its time was one of those vectors. In our time, the question is, what is the steam engine of our time? Now, let me start. Can I walk? Can I walk? You have it? Right. I want to invite you to look at this admirable graph. This is 2001. This is just one financial instrument. It represents 10% of the value of finance in this period. So here, can you see this or not? Do you see well? So this is 919 billion. Huh? It's just below. Just about 7 or 8 years later, this instrument is 62 trillion. Now that is far more than the currencies, the standard measure, the currencies of all the countries in the world. It's an amazing amount, 62 trillion. Those 62 trillion, thank you, nice instrument, is only 10% of the value of high finance at that time. 600 plus trillion. This is like, it's not money. Not all the currencies of the world, you put them together, you don't get that. It's something else. We think of it, we name it as money. It is not money. And I think a smarter way of engaging it and trying to understand what are its
weaknesses, how can we interfere, is to think of it as a capability. Capability tends to have a very positive meaning, of course. Well, this is not necessarily positive. So I just want you to keep this little example in mind. Second element, Bernanke. Do you remember Bernanke, the head of the central bank, of the Fed, as we call it here? When he steps down a few years ago, and this was a smart Princeton professor, rather boring, terribly serious, didn't duly engage in a fight, but he was a very decent person, sort of. So when he steps down, he gives this big discussion. Nobody heard that? Okay. So he said all the things that are good and bad, etc. And then he says, this is his language, not mine. I could have come up with a language, no, it's his. He says, and then we have a large number of dark pools in finance. Now, I don't know how many of you can appreciate that that's a rather unusual language for the head of a central bank to use. Large, dark pools in finance, dark pools in finance. And he told us at that point that most of financial trading happens in private networks. The stock market, ladies and gentlemen, is for us, the little people. The real stuff of this economy that reaches trillions and trillions is not the stock market. This is a set of private networks, so mother banks, so to say, that then all kinds of investors and other entities move in. They become part of those networks. Those networks are private. We don't get to see them. We don't have access to them. The head of the central bank didn't have access to them. What actually happens in the stock market, which is a public domain, which we all think, well, all those people who are doing the money blur, the stock market, it's visual, it reports. Well, that's just one little bit. They run some of that stuff through the stock market, but that's not the real action. I'm hoping that, I know that finance is a bit of a weird subject, but I'm hoping that I'm conveying to you that there is a whole world of grabbing complexities, etc., that we simply have no access to. And he enabled us, Bernanke, to begin to understand that this was happening. The language he used, dark pools, he invented that term. Well, invented, the words were not even, they existed. But that's unusual. Now, he was no lefty, Bernanke. He was a very traditional, etc. But it was just a bit too much because he was in that position and he knew that all kinds of investment stuff was happening that he was totally out of. Whereas the way the politicians think of it, the way our politicians also have a particular problem of they don't do their homework, that kind of a thing. But, it's like this is one little bit of a rather rapidly growing operational space that is a bit terrifying. Third instance, you all heard of the famous crisis, right? Which left 14.5 million households in a period of 8 or 9 years without a home. Some of them kept on staying in the homes, but basically they lost everything. 14.5 million households can be up to 30 million people. It depends how many babies they have. Are they married? Whatever. But much more than just. Now, I'm Dutch. The total population of my country is about 16 million. It means that what happened here, and we couldn't see it, all those materialities that our eyes could not grab it was too much, so to say, is one way of putting it, was a vast number of people were expelled from their home. I need to give you a footnote now that some of you might find a bit unnecessary, but some of you might appreciate. And that is, this was not, the instrument developed was not about housing. It really had nothing to do with housing. It was something completely different. And most of those people who were hit, and most of the conventional analyses missed the point. What happened here was using low-income people who didn't own a house to produce an instrumentality. You can't even call it an instrument. So they said, sign, sign, you can have your house. In order to produce a condition where the high investment circuit was told that there were material goods. So it's not about the houses, it's about walls, materialities. Huh? The houses are the instrument, so to speak. But this was about what? Producing asset-backed securities. Asset. Something material, something real. The lie was there from the start. After 2 or 3 years of this instrument, the insiders had gotten their money because they had succeeded in producing an asset in a context via these modest little houses. In other words, we're talking about algorithmic mathematics, so it becomes a field of materialities, a door, a toilet, it doesn't matter. It's assets. You transform it into assets. And so the high investment circuit, they knew exactly what they were doing. 3 years into this process, they had enough to make a lot of money. The people who hung on to the instrument, both the families that had signed on, the modest families, but also the other kinds of people from the business sector, they lost. What we heard when all of this came out was everybody lost. That's not true. True that 14.5 million households, modest households, lost. Some investors lost. But the core actors, they knew exactly what they were doing. And after 3 years of this is a process that lasted between 8 and 9 years, as I said. After 3 years, they were out of there. And they had gotten their good. What is the good that they got? What they had, when those people signed off, I mean, this is like almost unbelievable. When they signed off, they said, okay, yes, I'll buy this house. Just, they said, they didn't ask for anything, just sign. And footnote, battalions, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people were sent out to go to these households and say, okay, sign, you can buy, you can have this house, you don't have to pay anything now. You know, I mean, this stuff is like disgusting. Anyhow, so there were two realities, well, the three realities. The realities of the mostly very modest families. You know, we still live in a country where most people own a house, which is going to change rather quickly, I think, but still. So those who did not own a house are really very modest people. They fell in the trap. So coming back to the question of the asset. So what this meant was not housing. This was assets. In other words, the value of the project had nothing to do with housing. It was about asset-backed securities, which is a desirable financial instrument. Derivatives, the high investment circuit, they don't want derivatives. They say derivatives is for us, the modest people. Don't invest in derivatives. Let me assure you it's a mistake. Those are dead. They're going losing. Some of these derivatives are chains that have lasted 25 years. You will regularly hear, like the latest one was in Italy, 14 municipal governments, all at the same time, went bankrupt. Why? They had bought a certain type of derivative. And this sort of story, the same thing has happened in the United States. I have quite a few examples. Anyhow, so what I find extraordinary is the capacity to use brilliant minds, in this case the brilliant minds of physicists, to produce something that is foundationally extractive. And once you have extracted, what you leave behind might as well be dead stuff. It doesn't count. It doesn't matter. So, and again, I repeat, in the United States, we have had several municipal governments that fell into the trap of the derivatives and that went broke. So this notion of the asset-backed securities, is actually a real value. Just to remind you, because you must all know about this, Here are the foreclosures that begin to happen. This is, again, those 14.5 million households that went broke. I mean, it repeats itself. You know, it's a certain kind of... But we're talking vast numbers. Now, as I said, you know, I'm Dutch. In my country, the number of people who lost their homes is the equivalent of the population of the Netherlands. And I repeat, I want to come back to this. We could not see it. We only heard the narrative that was produced in the media and also produced a bit by the financial system, which was, these were people who thought they could own a house. They weren't serious. They didn't realize, no, they could not own a house. You know, that kind of negative critique. But again, I want to return to this notion, what we see and what we cannot see, and sort of in a more abstract and more theorized zone, I like to examine this question of the material, the materialities, and the materialities that we cannot see. When you begin to think about that, you know, you see all kinds of situations where we realize we are not seeing it, even though it is material. I mean, we're seeing this. I'm not saying that our eyes are wrong. I'm just saying that there's a lot of stuff happening that consists of the material, but we don't see it. Let me give you an example, by the way. So I'm there in the field, it doesn't matter, somewhere, you know, in Iowa, and I'm chatting with these truckers. Huge trucks. I mean, huge trucks. I knew what I was doing, by the way. It wasn't a surprise, but I pretended to be a silly old woman. It always works. It's amazing. I mean, it's just amazing. And so I say, so what are you doing with all this trucking around? And they say, you know, we don't know either. But regularly we have to move these huge sheets of metal, you know, for construction. You know, from one place and then next week to another place. This became a public event, I mean a public lawsuit, so I can talk about it. There are other things that I cannot talk about. But in this case, you know what it was? Goldman Sachs had bought a huge, how do you say it, sort of a huge thing where you can have enormous sheets of metal. Hired the truckers, set up another place. Guess what was happening? As they moved the thing around, it created a crisis in a very abstract zone where a lot of the buying happens, of a scarcity of metal, which is crucial for the construction company. They delayed, and so what do you get? Guess what? The price of metal sheet went up, and then they put it all in the market. This is Goldman Sachs. Goldman Sachs is, in many ways, a distinguished firm with a lot of extraordinarily brilliant and intelligent physicists in it. And again, the physicists for me are, this is a separate story, but, you know, and it's trying to make money to, you know, to do dirty pool. I don't know if that is an English expression, but I sort of like the dirty pool part of it. You know, by having these truckers move this stuff around. This went into the public domain, and Goldman Sachs had to pay. You know, they try to avoid an indictment because that is not good for the business. And they paid $5.3 billion fine. 5.3 billion is quite a bit, huh? But of course they had made much more than that. So, you know, these are manipulations that you stand back and you say, wow. And so I want people to be aware of this. I mean, not that you would run into those truckers or into Goldman Sachs, but you know what I mean, to sort of, and I have a long list of these types of utility functions, is one way of putting it, you know, that are coming on. By the way, this instrument that I was talking about has now also entered Europe. Actually, it goes on here, I just see. Much smaller, the thing that brought the crises to those 14.5 million modest households, you know, that they lost everything. Well, that same instrument is now traveling, and evidently also in certain parts of East Asia. Now, one of the outcomes of what I described to you in terms of the housing aspect is that you wind up actually with a lot of empty land. I don't know what that means, but I know there probably is some meaning to it. Eventually we might see, you know, good or bad things. So I just like to put that on the record. Empty urban land. Yeah. Now, it is probably owned by some. They don't necessarily want to build modest housing for low-income people. Who knows how they will use it? So it's just... Now, here is yet another mutation of, what did I call it, of urban land, right? So this is something I'm tracking. It's 100 cities. We just get to 10 here, huh? And this is about buying up very high-end properties. It's happening in 100 countries that we know of, that we can track. This is just 1 year. New York, she likes to be the queen of the domain. Here she is at the top. Just 1 year, this figure, the growth is fairly low. Why? Because they had already been at it for a few years. Huh? So whereas London, the Metro London, much higher, not necessarily because of the value, but because they just entered that zone of selling properties. Of you know, it's sort of something that has to do with huge, expensive properties. And so you go down the, and here is a cousin that, oh, well, here you see a larger distribution. As you can see, a lot of the buying is at the top end, and then it goes down, 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 you know, but Toronto, San Diego, Philadelphia, Denver, Melbourne, Stockholm, Beijing, you know, all of these. In other words, there's a lot of buying of property. Now, some of that has happened for a very long time. This is just a scaling up of the matter, and I have more to tell about it, but I will proceed gradually. This is yet another measure. This is all foreign investors in property. And here London is really at the top. And just so you can see the thing, so Shanghai, higher, pretty high. Well, this is not, it doesn't give it. But anyhow, the main point that I want to make here is that, for instance, in London is a very good example. In London, the Qatari royals, you know whom I'm talking about, Qatar? They own more of central London, I love this, than the Queen of England, which I think is probably healthy for the Queen. The main owner, of course, is the old Duke, 800 years old Duke, huh? The main of property in London, for those of you who are aware of that. But anyhow, and this is just 1 year that I'm showing. Huh? So, you know, this is also quite an amazing, and here you have the distribution. Again, you know, it's very concentrated at the top, and then it thins out. And again, what I sort of grab onto a bit also is we can't see it. We just see the buildings. We don't see the processes that are in play. They are materialities, and we can't see it. This is a bit the philosopher in me. Now here's one example that I wanted to give you. So forget about Nanjing. These are 4 major cities in Germany. So Berlin, very high, still demand, but it has a minus. Why? Because the interest, they have bought what they wanted, and now they're buying less. The total amount is still very high. You understand? So in other words, this is a real curve. Everything here is a curve. You buy, and then you've done it, and then you exit. So that is what we capture here. So Hamburg, which is the latest queen that they went for, is higher than Berlin, but Berlin has far higher figures. Now, Hamburg might get there. So I just want to make sure that people understand the arrangement here. Now, a lot of flight capital, we know this, is going into buying, I can't read it, high-end housing, blah, blah, we can skip that. Now, for me as a researcher, you know, what does this all look like? Again, we cannot see it. We cannot see that a lot of these properties are actually owned by foreigners. So this is central London. This is the Thames, as they call it. I think we still call it the Thames or something. I don't know what we do here. But these are all very special houses. I don't think this one is particularly impressive, but anyhow, that's just me. And so I have one of these German journalists, they're killers, says, okay, I want to walk with you in some of these areas that you are describing. And I never go there. My sources of data are not going there. And so this is central tourism. And so we're walking around, and I hear these tourists say, look at all these beautiful British buildings. Huh? None of them is owned by a Brit. They are all owned by one Chinese company. I have no problem with that. But what I find, again, interesting is how the material loses capacity to be speech. We tend to think that the material tells us something, that it is what it is. Well, this is one example. This is sort of an easy example, I admit. But you see what I mean. This is another story. This is some big buildings in Manhattan, and a Chinese. This is here or not? No, but it was very funny at one point because a Chinese bought it, and they wanted to call it Pacific. It's called Atlantic Yards. It's on the Atlantic. This is New York, etc. The Chinese wanted to call it Pacific because the Pacific is more their ocean. And of course that created a lot of mirth, is to put it kindly, in New York, because somehow to call something big buildings on the, in New York, to call them Pacific was, anyhow, so they changed their mind, I guess. But anyhow, they also own all of that. Now, I want to repeat, I have nothing against the Chinese. I love China. The first time I was in China, I was 17 years old, and so it's been a significant part of my life. Now, the top 100 cities, just this stuff that I've been talking about, the top 100 cities by property investment. In other words, it's just a question of the value of the building. It doesn't have to do, are they beautiful, are they good, and where they are. Represent 10% of the world's population, 30% of the world's GDP, 76% of property investment. Now, what is an important point to emphasize here is these are buildings that are in play in a very particular kind of market, which is high-end housing market. So this is just a minority. 76% is just the actual thing. There are many, many buildings that are not in play. So I don't want you to think that 70% of all the buildings. No, it's those buildings that have been made into, and watch out that this one doesn't become one of them, into these assets. They're seen as assets. People are buying pieces, de facto pieces. It doesn't look that way on paper. That column might be one. If the building is very expensive, okay, you buy a bit. But you get the column. You don't know what you have, but anyhow, the material, right? And then it begins to circulate in other markets where it's not visible. So the issue the point that I'm making here is that when I look at a building now, I can't help but think, though, I'm sure this is absolutely kosher. Who owns it? And what do they own? They might just own that column. They might just own part of, it doesn't matter. Because it doesn't exist as such. It exists as a rather abstract instrument in asset-backed security. So anyhow, okay, and this is the value of all of these cities that are marked. This doesn't mean all the properties in a city. This just means those that are in play. And that comes from Seville. Those are not my data. Yet another iteration. This is 65,000 buildings in sort of the larger central London area, not central London, but the larger area in London. They are all owned by entities that have no name. All the entities are abroad. 65,000 buildings owned by foreign somethings that again don't have a clear designation. They have a very standard designation that we don't know what it means. I don't know what to make of this kind of stuff. I'm just putting it out there. But again, what strikes me is that our eyes see these nice local little London blah blahs. Well, they're not so little. They are fairly big. But in fact, that's not what they are. You know, what we see, we cannot. Well, you got my line here. We cannot grasp it. Other thing, Manhattan. We now have some very fancy buildings that have been built in Manhattan. I don't know, some of you recognize these. You know, these are, which one is this one? The Warner Center, the Bloomberg Tower. You know, we have several of these. These are residential, super luxury. People are living them. They never were fully occupied. And some people are just saying, I never run into anybody in this building. I'm moving out. Some people probably are still in there. Nobody is pushing. We didn't see an advertisement saying, oh, we have changed it all, and yes, and blah, blah. No, nothing. The question is, I mean, I inevitably then wind up with a question saying, well, one possibility, and I cannot document it, but it's one possibility, is that an empty luxury tower can deliver more profit than an occupied one. If it's occupied, you have the hassles, the this, that. How could that happen? Well, by algorithmic mathematics, you transform these towers. They don't look like towers anymore. They're just a field of assets. My take, and I've been tracking it in a few other countries, my take is that this is what's beginning to happen. It's very, very modest. You understand the point, right? In other words, we see the building, but the value is that it becomes an asset. Abstract term. You know, so it's material, but it's not about that tower. It's about assets, to build asset-backed securities. Here's another one of those towers, etc. Here's another one. Now, what do we have here? Inventing new housing markets. This is yet another. This came out in the Financial Times. I contributed to this, but this was mostly done by them. So this is another kind of market that has been established, which involves minimum prices. I mean, in other words, here are those prices, you know. And that was, these data come from at least 3 or 4 years ago. It came out in the Financial Times, as I said, in the FT. So the minimum, these are minimum prices. And it is a closed market. It's international, you can see. I mean, it goes on and on. Yeah? There are about 15 cities involved in this. And the nationalities vary, but it's actually quite interesting if one is either a geographer or a, you know, what are the nationalities involved, et cetera, et cetera. But again, it goes on. Hey? It's more than these. And so it's a brilliant concept. It's like, you know, when universities, say a university has a hospital, also a hospital function, and they then want to make a contact or a collaboration with another university that can be complementary in terms of the facilities and all of that. So it's a certain kind of market that has long existed, but not for this. It has existed for, as I said, you know, certain big institutions that recur, that need to have the knowledge. They can't handle the whole knowledge field, so they want to have these relationships with others. So now this is applied to housing. So it's a very elite group of cities and of, you know, with very high prices. By now those prices are much higher. So again, something that we cannot see it. We cannot see this transformation, but it's happening. And as you can tell, one of the issues for me, besides all the other issues, is the fact that the material is no longer as straightforward as it was. It was never completely straightforward, probably, but you know, you had sort of a sense a building is a building. Some of those earlier things that I showed, a building is not a building is an asset. a field of assets. Here are some of these houses, you know, that nobody's living in, and you wonder why. These are mostly in London, and the why is they have value. So, so one question that I'm going to finish. I have to finish, right? Am I not time and finish? Okay. So this is sort of a bit of a step back, you know, different. It's not connected to what I said fully. So urban formats of the future. This is a real place. This is in Venezuela. And what you can see here, these are very rich, high income. I've been there. Some of you might also have been there. And clearly, look at the density. Clearly, the street is a little in-between space. The question is, you know, this cannot end well. Either the elites are going to push these out, or they are going to, you know, it's just very, and we have, this is just one image. We have many such images. So again, coming back to a more familiar version of the housing question. This is what we, so this is a very Latin American view here. These are, many of these are reasonable little houses. This is real, huh? Many are reasonable little houses. They're modest. They're irregular often, but you know, and then you have that. Now, there is no place in the world where you, I am always asked this question, so now I know, where you can stand and see this, because I asked. A photographer, brilliant photographer, put these two together. In his mind, and he might not be totally wrong. In the United States, footnote, the United States is a very different country. You have so much space here, or we have. I'm actually also American a bit. And so he just juxtaposed. In many parts of the world, it's going in this direction. In parts of Asia, even in parts of Africa, in very crowded countries especially, you have this irregular housing that is not completely unreasonable, juxtaposed, you know, with luxury towers. And when there isn't land, we're building homes on water. This is clearly the case in Asia. And in Asia, this is now becoming, as many of you know, quite a dramatic little bit. I want to finish with one final item. This is it. So this is in Brazil. You can see the roads, etc. Habitat for Humanity. They said, okay, what can we do to help? This is in Rio. To help Rio slums be better. And so the people were worried, very modest, huh? They didn't want too much, you know, because they were afraid. They wind up, to make a complicated story short, saying, okay, we can clarify the street. So we push a bit out, etc., so that you can have traffic. This is Brazil. Guess what? Now the tanks can enter too. This captures the difficulty of addressing this aspect of the housing question. You know, that you try to help, you try to make it, and then you wind up in a situation, you get the picture, right? I'm going to end with that one. Thank you very much.
So Saskia has told us in a really rich way about the consequences of the housing crisis delivered upon a breathlessly awaiting global public in the earliest part of this decade. That story was told, at least the meltdown part, in Michael Lewis's famous book, The Big Short, turned into an absolutely stunning movie if you haven't seen it. But what Saskia is helping us to see is that the supposed repairs is really just a movement of the same capital into other dark pools, hard to see, mismanaged horribly, okay? And it is really interesting to see how societies respond to this. It has been my great misfortune to try to teach innovation in all four of the four largest banks in Australia, all four of the four largest banks in Canada, 5 of the 7 largest in Europe, and 7 of the 11 largest in the United States, and they're hopeless. I mean, they really, yeah, I know I'm the problem here, right here. I'll take the blame. But what I'm saying to you is that these are people that often don't see the mechanisms underneath their products, and they really aren't trying to be evil. They just can't see it very completely. And so it is interesting when some countries start to see the negative effects and then intervene with not very good instrument, regulations. One of the countries that you did not focus on is Iceland, which got completely wiped out. I mean, sent into bankruptcy by the same derivative instruments. And of course, in the western part of Canada, in Vancouver, they've found their marketplaces completely bought up, mostly by Russian and Chinese money. And so they recently passed a law saying that you could not use foreign capital to buy homes over a certain price, and inadvertently they destroyed the entire high end of their economy, not just the real estate part, but everything else that made the Canadian economy and the western side of Canada function. So finding ways to think about this deeply enough, Saskia, is hard. And one of the things that designers often contribute, still missing in your slides, is big data modeling and the ability to visualize complicated systems. I'm wondering if any of that has found its way to you yet, the idea that we could visually begin to see how the systems are having these kinds of consequential effects. You want to talk into that?
Right.
Mike?
Yes, I mean, I do think, well, this seems to be off for some reason. Okay, like I emphasized throughout the talk, right, I am concerned about the fact that the material is not necessarily telling a full story, not that it ever did, but it is now, I would say, in extreme condition. And the critical actor and innovator, I mean, there are others, is this capacity via algorithmic mathematics to transform the X into a non-X. I mean, this is just extraordinary forms of intelligence and knowledge. That they get misused this way is a pity. Most of the physicists that I know are really lefties, you know. But I have one buddy at Columbia University who's not a lefty, and he works for Goldman Sachs. So he passes me some of the dirt that I cannot mention here. But clearly, the financial system is trouble right now. The major firms, I'm not saying that there are very many long family established, they're fine. But it really has developed and the way to think about it, it has developed capabilities that come down to extractions. And just to finish, and as with mining, once you have extracted, you really don't care what happens next, right? And that is a bit the scenario that I see recurring.
Well, I love this analogy to extractive systems. So 2 observations, and then we'll turn it over to questions. The first one is that Saskia, who is clearly better behaved than I am, did not mention the fact that a week ago today, the second highest court in this country has decided that the president actually has to allow his accounting firm to give up his taxes. Most people believe that what we're going to discover, if ever we do get to see those taxes, is exactly the extractive pattern you're describing, that he's selling cheesy Trump condos overpriced by millions, mostly to foreign people hiding their ill-gotten gains, and compounding that by rating his properties at one very high inflated level every time he needs to finance them, and rating the exact same properties at extremely low levels every time he has to pay taxes on them. And these things are profoundly illegal. So So he's stalling to try to make sure nobody can ever see his taxes, but it's exactly the kind of issue that Saskia is helping us to see, the dark systems that don't allow us transparency and don't allow the regulations to actually sort of connect to it. But the analogy to extractive systems is actually interesting too. One of my favorite innovations developed in last year by my team was in gold mining. Okay? Now here's how gold mining works. You find a tin pot dictator somewhere in the world that has a mountain, and you'd say to the dude, there's like gold over in them there hills, and if you let us, we'll dig it out for you, you'll be filthy stinking rich. And the tin pot dictator says, that sounds pretty good. How long is that going to take? And we say, well, best case, maybe 10, maybe 11 years. Oh, man. And how am I going to explain it to the people? And you say, oh, that's easy. We're going to tell them all about the great jobs that we're going to have, and we're going to promise that they'll all be gainfully employed. And oh, by the way, we have to build roads up to that mountain, so they'll have roads, and maybe we'll put in a clinic somewhere. There'll be all kinds of lies you can tell them. This is great. This is really fabulous. And what you don't want to tell them, the mining companies like to say, is that, by the way, when we're done, there won't be a mountain left over. There will be a whole bunch of cyanide dripping all through the landscape. And the gold, by the way, the citizens will get none of that. Remember, it's the owner of the mountain that will tend to benefit. And does anybody in the room know what you do with gold after you mine it?
No.
You refine it, you put it into gold bars,
okay.
And you pay somebody a fortune to guard it forever at Fort Knox, okay? Less than 1/2 of 1% of mined gold is actually used in a functional way for human beings, okay? So, so here are the innovations that resulted. Turns out that if you use about 30 different innovations, you can model within weeks the ore body in that mountain and decide exactly how you would mine it most efficiently to get 97, 98% of the gold out of the mountain. You can do that with modern imaging and modeling techniques, and the minute you do, what you say to the tin pot dictator is, dude, if you insist, we'll dig it out of the mountain, but it'll take 11 years. Instead, how about we issue you a cryptocurrency backed by the value of the gold in that mountain? You won't get all the value, but you'll get 70% of it, and you'll get it right now. And that way you can actually use it for society and do something useful while stuffing your pockets with whatever you think you can steal and get away with. So that's an innovation in modern mining. It works in gold, doesn't work in coal, doesn't work in lithium, doesn't work in bauxite for aluminum, but it would be great if we did, right, Saskia? So the flip side of what Saskia is doing for us, I think, is the important question asked of designers: what the hell do we do to prevent this kind of darkness, lack of transparency, hidden, tax on society, and disruption to the kinds of things that would actually address the divide that you're showing in your slides at the tail end? There are many, many, many new kinds of understandings of this. For instance, the Gini coefficient, now used everywhere in the world to determine the ratio of the highest, paid people in your economy to the lowest paid people in your economy, and whether or not your economy is fair. So the presence of a Gini coefficient, authored everywhere in the world and used with a similar methodology, can help us to understand some of the effects of this piracy before we, actually understand the mechanisms of how it's being hidden, right? So. Sure.
Yeah, look, I agree with what you're saying. Yeah. You were done, or?
No, tell me about the problems.
Of the Gini coefficient?
Anything you want to say.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I thought I'd sort of talked about quite a few thingies already. You want me to say? No, the Gini coefficient, look, the Gini coefficient works for some. No measure is perfect. No measure can capture the full domain it is meant to capture. We know that. But that doesn't mean that we can't give up, and that doesn't mean that we can also use the Gini. But some people are resisting the Gini. They say it's biased. You know how that goes with it. But anyhow, I don't know if you have questions or. Yeah.
Unfortunately, you're going to have to figure out how to use that mic while I pass this one around. Should try it. Just say.
Yes? No. Doesn't work. But maybe, okay, let's not worry. Let's just get that question and we'll see how it
All right.
Oh, because they need the mic?
Well, that was one of the.
Can you shout?
As long as you repeat the question. We'll
Okay, fine. Yeah. I mean, this is really an extraordinary capability. You know, a 5-year-old can construct a sort of algorithm. It's very simple, right? But what we can do with it, I mean, it's an extraordinary tool. So it's both totally admirable, and at the same time, it can be used. But this is not a new story, of course, in our history, our human history, that we have developed brilliant instruments, like beautiful swords, to go kill. So that is part. But I frankly, when I think, and I'm of a certain age, you know, I wonder what's next, and I think what's next is going to happen after I'm dead. So that invites always, what could it be, you know? And when I look at the long histories of plays, I don't want to simplify, but it's sort of a curve effect. If people are involved, it can make a difference. I don't mean the financiers, I mean your average, whatever, in the sense that they will fight back. When you think of whatever the freedoms that were acquired in different countries by modest people, by the modest classes, you know, it was to a very large extent they who launched the concept. You see, the modest classes got to irritated the higher classes. I mean, England is full of very interesting examples because England was of an elitism that was a horror. And sooner or later, the masses of people who were maltreated, who were malnourished, who were ill, who were attacked, who were killed, who were cut into pieces. You know, nothing is perfect, by the way. I do not think that there is one perfect regulatory mode that we have. But it is interesting to see how, and again, I come back to this notion, you know, if we can think of it to simplify, that it is a curve. Abuse, 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 and then something gives. Now, I would say that today in the United States, we are again on this curve because we have been maltreated. You know, I would say for the last 20 or 30 years, we're just beginning to see this new uptick. It's never going to be all people, but it's enough people. You know, that to me is also very interesting. And there the city is an important space. Messy as it might be, unjust as it might be, doesn't matter. There are capabilities embedded in this type of space that is a city. We the people, that is our space. It's the city. I don't want to romanticize here, but what I'm saying is it's one of the places where those without power get to make a history, get to make a politics. You know, it's far more difficult on a plantation, in a mine, or in a very small town. So the city. And that is why we need to protect the cities. Like, I really think that some of our cities are far too big, so they are becoming really negatives. We need new cities in a way. Spaces that can be managed where you feel okay. Huh? Okay.
Can I please beg? We've resurrected this. So,
Okay, very good.
Again, in just a moment I'll be there. So you're very good at sort of thinking through systems problems using analogies. The extractive industries analogy is good. One of my guesses is that the way we can intervene to fix these urban problems and identify the effects, positive or negative, of financial instruments is through better visualization of complex information. So I'm wondering if you were seeing any analogy to, say, for instance, functional magnetic resonance imaging, the very enormous field that allows us to figure out what's going on in people's brains while they're still using them?
But also, like London, I don't know if any of you has been in London. In London, you don't smell, when the cars are all there, you don't smell anything negative. It's hell. It's absolutely chock full of killer elements. We just don't see them and we don't smell them. So in that sense, we depend on a range of instrumentalities to capture. And so people are now beginning to leave London when they have small children because it really is bad. It may be not as bad as Flint. You know Flint, what I'm talking about.
We know.
We all have this image of one kid that was older in the same family who's tall and strong, and the other one who's born when the disastrous water thing, who is much smaller and weaker. That's catastrophic. And who knew that was poisonous stuff? Sure. I think that the chemical industry did know. But were they going to talk about it? So we need to be witnesses, and we need to enforce accountabilities. That is part of the project. And why don't we end on that note? And
No,
I was going to say,
you're not done yet.
the
We've got a few
Latina
more
in me
minutes.
was going to say, and have a glass of wine, but I realized that's not on, right? No, but that's
You're
okay.
totally free to do that at lunchtime. To your exact point about city air, the two largest cities in China had an extraordinarily popular app that would just tell you the air condition every day. And it would tell you that before you walked out of your house. And in many, many days, the app was just flashing red that it was a very dangerous day to be outside. So naturally, the governments in those two cities outlawed the app and wiped it out. And then the mechanism that was really interesting is that the government leaders had children. And they wanted to know if they could bring their kids out. So systematically and steadily, they finally brought that app back because the leaders needed it. And so again, my point is that the part of the designer's role in complex systems may be to produce the compelling things that simplify hard stuff and make black boxes into glass boxes that we can understand. There's a question here for you.
Okay, yes.
Hi. Well, I've been wondering about university finances, and especially university finances and urban universities. So I went to the University of Chicago. I work at the University of Illinois at Chicago. Both of those institutions have been involved in or it's not separate from real estate. They have for decades been involved in programs that develop, urban redevelopment programs that had the consequence of pushing people out and, reinventing some of the areas as these sort of, corporate, commercial areas. But it doesn't seem like a complicated algorithm, but the dean of the school where I teach has been saying that our programs owe the dean's office money, and we're supposed to pay it back in installment plans, and they're claiming there's not enough money for hiring faculty, and it's our labor that's being extracted. And that in universities in the past 40 years, the division between administrative salaries and faculty salaries has widened, and the proportion of adjunct labor has increased. in the last 40 years, yeah. I mean, I've lived through the last 40 years, so I've seen it happen. And I feel like there's something going on with university financing that needs to be discussed.
You know, the whole bit of these very sort of, you know, that kind of finance that I was talking about, which is not commercial finance, it's a different kind of finance. I think that is present now in many, many sectors. So the story that I said about Goldman Sachs is about high finance, but there they were. And that's not the only one. We have a long list of how these high-level financial firms are playing with water, with, I mean, you name it. The capacity to financialize just about everything. I exaggerate here because they have not reached our bodies yet, not fully, but it's quite something, and it's an admirable instrument, an admirable form of knowledge. But as we know from other elements, it can be deployed, you know, also in very negative ways. I mean, that is truly, it's quite problematic. But at the same time, I see the young generations, the knowledges they are after are different from the knowledge when I started. I'm 72 years old, right? So I have a long history. When I look at that earlier period, you know, when I was just beginning to, it's a totally different set of concepts and projects, and that is why at the start when I was talking about these knowledge silos, we need to cut out, because now we have very old knowledge very often. Old knowledge in the sense that it's been around for 35 years, it's done its job, it's time to, okay, let me try. We keep it there, nicely there, but we need some other. We really need. But I see a lot of young people. I teach this undergraduate class at Columbia University, which was meant to be, you know, these universities like small classes. Well, this class is usually, I always have 200 students, and the waiting list goes up to 800 students on the waiting list. Because I cover this broad spectrum, and they're intelligent, because in a class like that, you have people from the sciences, you know, from everything. And it's just great. I've now been teaching it for 10 years, and I will have some students who start, you know, they're juniors or whatever, or what are the younger called, and then by the time they are seniors, I then select them out and say, okay, now you can come because it's the last chance. But it gives me such satisfaction to see these types of intelligences that are a bit transversal, you know, that are not stuck. I mean, we all need the highly specialized, huh? I need a surgeon for whatever, I want highly specialized. But we also need the other part, and that is sort of what...
Got time for just a couple more questions, sir?
Yeah. I'm curious about thinking about the role of transparency and visualizing data, but at a moment when, to me, it seems like the nature of data, if I understand what you're saying, where when things have been transformed from X to non-X, then it seems like even understanding the nature of that data feels like a critical part of doing that. So I'm curious if you have any thoughts about the nature of representing data when that data itself is transforming.
Right. Well, I don't know if I totally understood, but my emphasis is on the fact that even if it is fully, this is not a good example, by the way, but even if it is fully material, we may not be able to capture it for a whole mix. Like when I said about those 14.5 million households, which could be up to 30 million people. Well, the length of time, several years, the multiple, we don't see. You know, to me, this is, and so the big question for me is what else that we should be seeing, whether it's these eyes or other vectors, because we have many different ways of seeing, right? I mean, that's one of the things that is very good about current technologies that we have. We can see, right? And so we need to really emphasize the awareness is one very mild way of putting it, you know. Brutality is another way of putting it, which, you know, can be. But it's both positives and negatives. I mean, to me, this seems a very important project. And yeah, well, I said it. Thanks for the comment. Oh.
Hi. So I think that the point that you make is an important one, this idea that you have these invisible processes underlying.
Can you talk a bit closer to the mic?
Sure, yes. I think that the point that you're making is a significant one about this idea that you have underlying or invisible processes shaping these real systems. And so I'm curious about your perspective when we think about, sort of the abstract economy and how it engages or how it interacts with real systems. How it's interacting with real systems like sort of housing, property, even something like a food system. Yes. Is there, do you think that there's sort of, what do you think is the role of these sort of abstract economies, and is there a way to sort of generate a mediatory mechanism in the interaction?
That's a very good point. I mean, we all remember, of course, the apple, whatever we call it, which always every year new. And then people began to notice the mountains of garbage, right? So what we need is, again, with my modest, transversal, cut across. We need to discover. This is an epoch for discovering. The stuff is there. It's happening in many diverse places with many different forms of knowledge. You go to Africa, they have knowledges that we lack, in some of these poorer but functioning villages. I spent a lot of time in Japan. Japan has knowledges that we don't have. They're our neighbors, so to say. They are our brothers and sisters. And so it seems to me that where we are failing, where our universities are a bit stuck, is that this specialization, and you go. Now, as I said, if it is about a surgeon, you want specialization, right? But for so many other things, not. When I see my colleagues at my university, I see them just getting lost. Well, I've said it now 3 times, so you know what I mean. And I think, my God, here are these brilliant minds, these dedicated, hard-working academics. Blah, blah. What the questions we should have seminars where we don't talk about our work, where we talk about what we don't know, what is happening, what is real, how to cut across. It can be done, and I think it's beginning to happen. I see that younger generations have different ways of setting the boundaries, except if they cut up. When they're graduate students, there the problems start, because then they're captured a bit by the professors who say, you are going to do what I did. That's a real problem. I really have a very strong objection to that. I mean, especially the men. I don't have anything against men, but the men are shameless. Some of these professors are positively shameless. I would never tell one of my graduate students that they have to sort of. I just couldn't. On the contrary, let them, sort of push open new. Anyhow, I now said it twice, so I think.
At least it comes as no great surprise to me that there are 800 people at any given moment trying to sign up for her class. So we're very lucky to have you, Saskia, for too short a time. I sense that there were many more questions people wanted to ask. In design terms, one of the things that Saskia is pointing to is a new rising field of integrative thinking. And it is said to be one of the antidotes or counterweights to specialized thinking. And I think it's a very important systems question to try to figure out how to bring many different kinds of specialized eyes onto a prize and have them actually lift each other up instead of just failing to communicate with one another. Yeah. This is the world you're pointing us to, a world of extraordinary importance, urgently needed. It is my pleasure to gift to you the same book from our distinguished professor, Charles L. Owen, who made this school think about systems in a very deep way.
You've all seen it, right? You're all, yes.
He's a hero around these parts.
Wonderful.
And I don't know if you heard, Professor, but Saskia is desperately in need of a glass of wine, so that's on you, okay? And you'll be around for a little while?
Yes.
So please, if you had a question and we didn't get to it, please find a chance to ask Saskia directly. Thank you so much.
Thank you.